The sun beat down relentlessly on the canyon walls as Staff Sergeant Dmitry Petrov stood at the checkpoint, his boots stirring up dust with every shift. His eyes scanned the road ahead, barely registering the handful of refugees lingering by the roadside. They were all just faces in the heat haze, families clinging to hope, old men with weathered faces, women clutching children, and then her. She stood apart, her posture calm, almost too calm for someone who had survived this long. Her clothes were faded, worn from travel, but something in the way she stood caught Petrov's attention. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't begging for passage. She wasn't even trying to catch his eye. She just stood there, watching, waiting. When he waved her through, she moved without haste, slipping past the other refugees as if she belonged. He'd seen too many faces in his time to be fooled by the quiet ones, and yet he let her pass without a second thought. She had a story, but it wasn't his to question. The convoy was already behind schedule, and every delay was another moment closer to disaster. "General Webb's orders," Petrov muttered into his radio. General Webb's voice crackled through, as calm and methodical as always. "How many? 12? Your call, Sergeant." Petrov exhaled sharply, looking back at the refugees. He didn't want to waste more time, but his gut told him that one of them was different. The woman with the canvas bag, Nadya Halil. He hesitated, then decided, let her through. The others were processed and packed into the supply truck, but Nadia's presence lingered at the back of his mind as the convoy moved forward into the canyon. The route was treacherous, narrow, and full of choke points where ambushes could happen at any moment. The road snaked through the canyon walls like a thread through a needle. The convoy was vulnerable, and Petrov's instinct screamed that something was wrong. As the convoy moved deeper into the canyon, Nadia's gaze never wavered. She studied the ridgelines, the rocks, the wind. It was as if she could read the terrain like a book, assessing everything and everyone around her. And then the first shot rang out. It was a clean shot, from an impossible angle. Petrov's heart stopped as the explosion of metal and fire rocked the convoy. The lead Humvee was struck first, its axle shattered by an RPG. The chaos that followed was like a well-executed trap. Petrov's years of training kicked in immediately. He gave orders to dismount, find cover, return fire. Soldiers scattered, doing what they could to survive. But amidst the gunfire and screaming, he couldn't help but notice something else. Nadia wasn't hiding. She was gone. In the middle of the chaos, the woman had vanished without a trace. Where had she gone? A moment later, a distant shot cracked through the air. The sound was distinct. Not the usual random fire from insurgents, but something more precise. And that was when Petrov saw her, perched on top of the second supply truck, rifle in hand. Nadya Halil wasn't just a refugee, she was a sniper, a professional, a ghost. The woman they had let slip through their fingers. The convoy was trapped, pinned down in the canyon with no way to retreat, but Nadia was already moving, methodical and ruthless. She had already taken out 5 enemy snipers by the time the general realized who she really was. And by the time the firefight died down, no one could explain how she had managed to save them. No one but the soldiers who would live to tell the tale. General Webb had his suspicions, but in the chaos of battle, there was no time for questions. Nadia had disappeared again, blending into the crowd of refugees as if she had never been anything more than a shadow. But for Petrov, it was too late to turn back. He had seen her, and he knew the truth. She was hunting the war, not fleeing from it. And the next time the war came for them, she would be there again, a ghost in the shadows, waiting for the next target. "What do we do now?" Petrov asked, his voice strained. Webb looked at him, his eyes tired but resolute. "We finished the mission." The convoy was battered, but it had survived. As they reached the forward base, the soldiers filed out, tending to the wounded and securing the area. But the question that gnawed at Staff Sergeant Petrov remained, who was Nadya Halil? The refugees were being processed in the back, a routine that had become second nature to the soldiers. Yet Petrov couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He turned to find General Webb speaking to one of the medics, and in the background, Nadia was moving through the crowd, blending in seamlessly with the other displaced civilians. Her presence was like a dark cloud hovering just out of sight, a reminder of the encounter in the canyon that they still couldn't explain. Petrov found himself staring at her again, this time more aware of the way she carried herself. There was no fear in her eyes, no desperation. She was just waiting, as if she had been through this many times before. There was something about her calmness that unnerved him. After a while, the camp settled into its usual rhythm. Soldiers performed their duties. The refugees were given shelter and food, yet the tension lingered, like a storm waiting to break. Petrov made his rounds, checking in with his men and assisting with the administrative work. His mind, however, kept drifting back to Nadia. He couldn't get the image of her from the truck roof, rifle in hand, picking off targets with surgical precision. It had all happened too quickly for him to process. But now, in the quiet aftermath, the truth was dawning on him. Nadia wasn't just a survivor. She was a weapon with no allegiance, no orders, and no chain of command. Petrov found himself wondering how many others like her were out there, soldiers who had vanished without a trace, left behind by a system that had abandoned them. He caught sight of General Webb again, talking to the refugee coordinator. Their conversation was too quiet for Petrov to hear, but the general's face had hardened, his eyes narrowed. Webb was a man who had seen too much, but even he seemed to be struggling with the enigma that was Nadya Halil. She had vanished from the convoy like a ghost, just as quickly as she had appeared. A few hours later, when Petrov was finally able to steal a moment of peace, he stood near the makeshift perimeter, looking out across the desolate land. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. The distant rumble of military trucks filled the air, but it was the silence that unsettled him. The war was never truly silent. There was always something in the air, an undercurrent of violence, of impending danger. And yet, in the midst of it all, Nadia had remained an unsettling calm. He knew what she was capable of. He had seen it in the canyon. He had seen the way she operated, how she calculated her shots with the precision of a machine. He knew that if she wanted, she could have taken out the entire convoy without breaking a sweat. Instead, she had chosen to save them. It didn't make sense. Why save them? She wasn't one of them. She wasn't a soldier. But there was no denying the truth. Nadia had made her choice. And somehow, despite everything, Petrov knew that she wasn't done yet. He turned away from the horizon, his mind racing. The next move in this strange game was hers to make. But for now, she was a shadow among the refugees. He couldn't help but feel the weight of what that meant. He knew there was more to her than anyone had realized, and he feared that the war, in all its chaos, would soon call upon her again. The night passed in a blur of routine activities, but Staff Sergeant Dmitry Petrov couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. It was like a splinter under his skin. Irritating, persistent. By morning, the base had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but something had shifted. The air felt heavier. The usual chatter and clatter of soldiers getting ready for their next mission was subdued. Even the refugees, huddled together in the makeshift shelters, seemed to sense the change. They whispered among themselves, exchanging glances. Petrov could feel it in the air, the calm before the storm, but he couldn't figure out where it was coming from. He stepped out of the barracks and made his way to the supply trucks. The usual sounds of movement, the metallic groans of cargo being loaded, the hum of the generators, they should have been familiar, comforting even. But today they felt foreign, wrong somehow. He found General Webb standing near the supply trucks, his face tight with tension. Webb had that look about him again, the one Petrov had seen 100 times in combat, eyes sharp, scanning the perimeter, alert to every movement. "Sergeant," Webb greeted him with a nod, his voice gruff but steady. "You've been busy." Petrov nodded, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. As if on cue, Nadya Halil appeared at the edge of the supply yard, her movements purposeful yet fluid. She didn't glance at anyone, didn't acknowledge her presence. She simply walked, her canvas bag slung across her shoulder as though she were just another face in the crowd. But Petrov knew better now. She was different. She wasn't one of them. She wasn't a refugee. She was a trained operative, a ghost in the system. Webb's eyes followed Nadia for a moment before he turned back to Petrov. "Keep an eye on her," he said quietly, his tone heavier now. Petrov nodded, but he had no intention of keeping a low profile. The war had taught him that the quiet ones were the most dangerous. The ones who blended in, who watched and waited. Nadia wasn't running from the war, she was hunting it, and if she was here, if she was moving with purpose, then something was about to happen. Petrov's gut told him that the attack wasn't over. It had only just begun. The convoy was about to move out again, and this time there was no telling what they were walking into. Petrov watched Nadia for a few more moments as she disappeared into the crowd of refugees. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. The convoy was preparing to leave. General Webb's voice crackled over the radio, sharp and clear as ever. "All units, prepare to move out. We're not waiting for anyone. Get in and get out, no delays." The order was simple, direct, and carried the weight of authority that only someone like General Webb could command. Petrov made his way to the convoy's lead vehicle, his thoughts still on Nadia. She had to be the key to whatever was coming. There was no other explanation. As they prepared to move, Petrov found himself scanning the horizon, his eyes searching for any sign of movement, any clue that might give them a heads up. But nothing appeared. The wind had kicked up, dust swirling around the convoy as they rolled out of the base. The narrow canyon ahead loomed like a trap, a perfect ambush waiting to happen. Petrov's instincts were on high alert. This was too familiar. The landscape, the route, they were all too predictable. And that's when he saw it. A flicker of movement from the ridge above, a single figure barely visible in the dust and wind. Someone was out there, watching them. Petrov's heart skipped a beat. His instincts were screaming now. "General," he said into his radio, his voice steady but urgent, "I think we're walking into another trap." Webb's response was immediate. "Eyes sharp, Sergeant. Stay alert." Petrov's gaze never left the ridge. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts. And right now, they were telling him that this mission was about to take a turn for the worse. As the convoy inched forward, the air grew thick with tension. The familiar sounds of military movement were drowned out by the wind, the sense of danger hanging over them like a storm cloud waiting to break. And then, just as Petrov felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, the first shot rang out. The first shot echoed through the canyon, shattering the tense silence. It was a clean, precise shot, the kind that made every soldier freeze, every instinct on high alert. Staff Sergeant Dmitry Petrov's heart slammed against his chest as the sound reverberated off the canyon walls. It came from the high ground to the right, and in the split second before the chaos descended, Petrov's mind raced. He knew what this was, an ambush. It was happening again. But this time, they were trapped. The lead Humvee shuddered as the RPG struck, the explosion reverberating through the convoy. Metal screamed as the vehicle spun sideways, tires shredded, slamming against the canyon wall. The deafening roar of the blast was followed by the sickening crackle of radio chatter. "Contact! Contact! We're under fire!" Petrov's training kicked in instantly. He dropped to the ground, seeking cover behind a nearby rock, eyes darting to assess the situation. Soldiers were scrambling for position, taking whatever cover they could find, but it was chaos. The convoy was pinned down. The mines buried in the road detonated one by one, sending plumes of black smoke into the air, filling the canyon with acrid fumes. In the chaos, Petrov's thoughts turned back to Nadia. She had been in the supply truck when the ambush hit, but now she was nowhere to be seen. His eyes swept the field, searching for any sign of her, but all he could see were the soldiers trying to regroup, the civilians huddled on the ground, and the enemy snipers positioned in the high ground. It was a textbook L-shaped ambush. Whoever had planned this knew exactly what they were doing. Petrov's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. Nadia wasn't just a bystander. She was part of the game. She had known this was coming. He turned to his rifleman. "Find her," he snapped. "Find that woman." But even as the words left his mouth, Petrov knew it was pointless. She had vanished into the chaos. In the midst of the firefight, Nadya Halil had disappeared once again, just like a ghost. Meanwhile, the firefight raged on. Enemy snipers from 3 different positions raining down fire. Petrov returned fire, his hand steady, but his mind was elsewhere. Every instinct screamed that Nadia was the key. Whoever she was no mere refugee. This was her world. She understood it better than anyone. The dust was thick in the air, choking the soldiers, blurring the view. The sound of gunfire and explosions seemed to stretch on forever. But then, Just as Petrov's mind started to spiral, he heard it, a single distant shot. The crack of a professional sniper's rifle cutting through the noise like a knife. It was different. It wasn't one of theirs. Someone had turned the tide. He scanned the canyon ridge, trying to pinpoint the source. That's when he saw her. Nadia. She was standing on the roof of the supply truck, rifle in hand, her posture eerily calm. She wasn't even looking at him. Her focus was fixed, steady, scanning the ridgelines, taking aim with an accuracy that sent a chill down Petrov's spine. A single shot rang out, sharp and clean. Petrov watched, his breath caught in his chest, as one of the enemy snipers collapsed on the ridge, a puff of dust rising where he had been standing. The sniper never saw it coming. Petrov's heart skipped a beat as the realization sank in. Nadia had saved them. Without a word, without a glance, she had taken out one of the snipers with surgical precision. And then, without hesitation, she moved again, adjusting her position, her rifle tracking her next target. She wasn't just surviving the war, she was controlling it. Petrov's gaze lingered on her, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Who was she really? And why had she chosen to save them? But the answer didn't come. Instead, the fight intensified. The enemy snipers began to fall back, disorganized, panicked. The precise, disciplined fire they had relied on was crumbling, disintegrating under Nadia's cold, calculated assault. She wasn't just a sniper. She was a force of nature. And the ambush, once carefully orchestrated, was starting to fall apart. General Webb's voice crackled over the radio. "All units, push forward. Flank right. We have the initiative." As the surviving soldiers surged forward, Petrov's eyes stayed fixed on Nadia. She wasn't finished yet. She was still hunting. But this time, it was the enemy that was being hunted. He had no doubt that the fight was far from over. But somehow, he knew that they had a chance now, and it was all because of the woman they had almost left behind. The convoy was on the move again, but now it was no longer a simple transport mission. The ambush had torn through them like a wave, but they were still standing, still moving. Petrov could feel the shift, the adrenaline pushing them forward, but it wasn't just the soldiers who had changed. The mood in the convoy was different now, more alert, more on edge. The survivors knew the stakes had shifted. It was no longer about the supplies they were carrying, or even the mission they had been assigned. Now it was about survival. And for Petrov, survival meant keeping an eye on Nadia. He didn't know what she was doing, or why, but it was clear she was no ordinary refugee. He had seen the way she moved during the ambush, like a trained soldier. She hadn't been running from the war, she had been hunting it. As the convoy rolled through the canyon, the soldiers remained tense, eyes scanning every ridge, every corner. The feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. The war was always there, just out of sight, ready to spring. But Nadia didn't seem fazed by it. She was still in the supply truck, her face hidden from view, blending in with the other civilians, but Petrov knew better now. She wasn't just waiting to be rescued. She was waiting for something. Petrov glanced over at General Webb, who was in the lead vehicle, his face etched with concentration. Webb had been quiet for the past few minutes, but Petrov could tell he was thinking the same thing. Nadia was more than just a witness to this war. She was a participant, a ghost in the machine, someone who operated outside the rules, and it was becoming increasingly clear that she wasn't going to stop. The convoy approached the next choke point, a narrow pass between two rock faces, the perfect place for another ambush. Petrov's instincts were on high alert again, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He knew the canyon like the back of his hand. He had driven this route dozens of times, but today everything felt different. The wind had shifted, the air thick with tension. He could almost feel the enemy watching them. They were waiting for the right moment, and so was Nadia. She had already proven she was capable of reading the battlefield like a seasoned soldier. Now, as they entered the narrow pass, Petrov found himself scanning the ridgelines again, trying to predict where the next attack would come from. That's when he saw it, a movement on the far ridge, a flicker of something, barely visible through the dust and rocks. It was too far to make out any details, but Petrov didn't need to see clearly. He knew what it meant. The enemy was setting up for another strike. He raised his hand to his radio, calling out to Webb. "Sir, we've got movement on the ridge. I think they're positioning for another ambush." Webb's voice crackled back through the radio, calm but urgent. "Stay sharp, Sergeant, we're not out of this yet." As if on cue, the first shot rang out, followed by a barrage of enemy fire. The canyon erupted in chaos. The sound of gunfire filled the air, reverberating off the canyon walls like thunder. Soldiers scrambled for cover, weapons drawn, but Petrov knew this time they weren't as prepared. The mines hadn't been detonated yet, but the enemy snipers had them pinned. The convoy was stuck in the kill zone. Petrov's eyes darted back to the supply truck where Nadia had been, but she was gone again. He didn't need to ask where she was. He could feel her presence, calm, focused, as though she had anticipated this, and then the rifle shot rang out. A single, clean shot that pierced through the chaos. Petrov didn't know where it came from, but he knew it was Nadia. He turned, scanning the ridgelines, but the enemy snipers had gone quiet. Something had shifted. The balance of the fight was changing again. He saw General Webb's vehicle move forward, and the soldiers began to push, slowly but steadily. The enemy was backing off, their discipline crumbling under the weight of their fear. Petrov moved quickly, directing the soldiers to advance, to flank the enemy positions. But in the back of his mind, he knew the truth. They weren't winning this fight because of their superior firepower or tactics. They were winning because of her. Nadia had made the difference once again. Petrov scanned the field, his eyes landing on the spot where she had disappeared. He could see the faint outline of a figure in the distance, moving swiftly, almost like a shadow. Nadya Halil wasn't just a sniper. She was something else, a force of nature, a ghost who moved through the chaos of war, untouched and untouchable. And no one, not even General Webb, knew how to stop her. The convoy finally reached the base, exhausted but intact. The mission was a success, at least on paper, but the real victory had been won in the canyon, and in the back of Petrov's mind he couldn't shake the question, who was Nadya Halil? The answer, he realized, didn't matter. She had already made her choice, and the war would follow her wherever she went. The base was quieter now, but the silence was deceptive. Beneath it, there was a sense of lingering tension, a sense that things were not as they appeared. Staff Sergeant Dmitry Petrov moved through the camp, his eyes scanning the faces of the soldiers, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman who had saved them. Nadya Halil. No one knew who she really was, and no one had the courage to ask. She had disappeared into the crowd of refugees as if she had never existed, but Petrov couldn't forget the way she had moved through the ambush, the way she had taken out snipers with the precision of a professional. She wasn't just a survivor of the war. She was part of it, part of the system, and that scared him more than anything. Petrov made his way to the command tent, his boots heavy on the ground, his mind still racing. General Webb was inside, speaking with a few of the officers about the next phase of the mission, but Petrov wasn't focused on the mission anymore. He was focused on what had happened in the canyon, what Nadia had done. When he entered, Webb glanced up from his conversation and nodded. "Sergeant," he said, his voice calm but hard. "Sit down." Petrov obeyed, but his eyes were already scanning the room. The other officers were focused on the mission, their minds already planning the next move. But Webb was different. His eyes were dark, thoughtful, as though he had been expecting this. "General," Petrov said quietly, "do you know who she is?" Webb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the table, as if considering the question carefully. Then, with a slow sigh, he looked back up. "Nadya Halil," he said finally, his voice distant, "is someone who should have died 3 years ago. But she didn't." Petrov's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Webb hesitated for a moment before continuing. "She was an operative, a sniper, Rachel Brennan." Petrov's heart skipped a beat. "Rachel Brennan? The one from the Northern Territories?" Webb nodded. "The same. She was part of a Black Ops mission, an operation that went wrong. We thought she was dead. Official reports said she died in a bombing. But she didn't. She went dark, vanished. And now, she's back." Petrov sat back in his chair, trying to absorb the gravity of what Webb had just said. Nadya Halil, Rachel Brennan, had been a ghost, a soldier who had disappeared, only to reappear in the midst of a convoy ambush, saving them with impossible precision. But why? Why had she chosen to help them? And what did she want now? Webb's eyes met his, And for the first time, Petrov saw something like uncertainty in them. "She's not working for us anymore," Webb said quietly. "She's a rogue agent, a ghost with a mission of her own, and I don't know if that mission will align with ours." Petrov felt a shiver run down his spine. This was bigger than anything he had imagined. Nadia, or Rachel, wasn't just a sniper. She was someone who had been left behind, someone who had been abandoned by the system she had once served. And now she was hunting something, hunting the people who had turned the war into a business. "What do we do now?" Petrov asked. Webb looked at him, his expression unreadable. "We finish our mission," he said, "and we try not to think about her." But Petrov couldn't stop thinking about her. Nadya Khalil was a ghost, a soldier with no orders, no chain of command. She was a force of nature, moving through the war like a shadow, untouchable and unstoppable. And if she chose to, she could make them all disappear. Petrov knew this wasn't over. The war wasn't over, and neither was Nadia's mission. She had made her choice, and now Petrov was wondering if he had made the right one. As he stood to leave, Webb's voice stopped him. "Sergeant," Webb said quietly, "keep your eyes open. Nadya Khalil may be a ghost, but there are still people out there who want her dead, and they will stop at nothing to find her." Petrov nodded, his mind still racing. There was no escaping this war. Not for him, not for Nadia, not for anyone. The days that followed felt like a haze, as though the war had seeped into every crack and crevice of the base, even in the quiet moments. Staff Sergeant Dmitry Petrov moved through it all, his mind occupied with the questions that lingered long after the chaos of the ambush had passed. Who was Nadya Khalil really? Why had she saved them? And what would happen when the system that had left her behind came looking for her again? The camp was still buzzing with rumors. Some soldiers called her the Ghost. Others called her the Angel of the Canyon. The stories spread like wildfire, growing more exaggerated with each retelling. But Petrov had seen the truth with his own eyes. He had seen her rifle, the way she moved, the way she calculated the shots with a precision he hadn't seen since the best of the special forces. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a soldier who had no country, no flag, no allegiance. She was beyond the war, beyond the rules. The next day, Petrov was called to the briefing room. General Webb stood at the front, his face as unreadable as ever. The room was filled with officers, all focused on the next phase of the operation. But Petrov couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The briefing started as usual, a dry rundown of the mission objectives, the logistics, the risks. But midway through, Webb stopped, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on Petrov. "Sergeant Petrov," Webb said, his voice carrying authority, "we have a new assignment. You're going to be part of the team that tracks down the rogue agent." Petrov's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly who Webb was talking about. Nadia, or Rachel, the woman who had saved them and then disappeared. "You're going after her?" Petrov asked before he could stop himself. Webb's eyes narrowed, and Petrov immediately regretted speaking out of turn. "Yes," Webb said coldly. "We have reason to believe that she's targeting high-value individuals connected to the arms trade. She's making her own war, and it's time to put a stop to it." The room fell silent. Petrov's mind raced. This was it. The ghost they had let slip through their fingers was now their target, and Petrov was going to be part of the team tasked with hunting her down. "We don't know where she's headed," Webb continued, "but we know she's making a move against people who are profiting from the war, and we need to stop her before she takes out any more targets." Petrov's gut twisted. He had seen the way Nadia moved. She wasn't a criminal, she was a soldier, and now they were treating her like an enemy. Webb was right about one thing: she was a rogue operative. But she wasn't the enemy. The real enemy was the system that had left her behind, that had sold her out, that had turned her into what she was. And now they wanted to hunt her down. Petrov's hand tightened into a fist. He couldn't do this. He couldn't go after her. He had to find another way. But there was no other way. He had no choice. He was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. As the briefing ended, Petrov stood up, his mind heavy with the weight of what he had to do. He didn't know how he was going to track her down. He didn't know if he even wanted to. But the orders were clear. The hunt was on. That night, Petrov lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. He kept coming back to the canyon, to the moment when he had first realized what Nadia was. She wasn't just a refugee. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a ghost, a soldier with no allegiance, no country, no past. And yet she had saved them. She had saved him. And now they were going after her. It didn't make sense, but it didn't have to, not in this war. There was no right or wrong. There was only survival. And as much as Petrov hated to admit it, he was part of the machine now, and the machine was going after Nadya Halil, the ghost, the soldier who had vanished and returned with her own mission, a mission that would either save the war or destroy it. But Petrov couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what happened, he would be forever haunted by her. Because Nadya Halil wasn't just a ghost. She was the war itself, and no one could outrun it. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation, but Petrov felt detached from it all. The routine had returned to the base, soldiers going through their motions, the usual grind of daily life in a war zone. But for Petrov, nothing felt normal. Every step, every decision, every mission now seemed tied to Nadya Halil. His thoughts spiraled around her, around the woman who had saved them, only to vanish, around the operative who had no allegiance, no command, no orders. She had her own mission, and Petrov knew it was one she wasn't going to stop. The orders had come down from General Webb: track down Nadia, find her before she could strike again. But Petrov couldn't shake the feeling that they were chasing the wrong ghost. Nadia wasn't the enemy. The enemy was the system that had created her, the war that had shaped her into something more dangerous than any insurgent. But those thoughts didn't matter now. Orders were orders, and Petrov had always followed orders. The team assembled in the briefing room early one morning, the weight of the mission heavy in the air. Webb stood in front of a large map, his face hard, his eyes scanning the room. "We have a lead," Webb said, his voice cold. "We know Nadia's targeting a high-ranking arms dealer in the Western Territories. We don't have much time. This is our chance to find her." Petrov stood at the back, his hands clenched at his sides. This was it, the moment of truth. He was going after her. He was going to hunt down the woman who had saved him, who had saved them all. He wasn't sure what he was going to find, but he knew one thing: the war had changed him. It had changed all of them. There was no going back. As the briefing ended, Petrov was given his orders. He would lead the operation, a small team of soldiers tasked with tracking down Nadya Halil. But as he made his way to the armory to gather his gear, something gnawed at him. He couldn't help but feel that they were walking into another trap. The convoy left the base under cover of darkness, the hum of the engines drowned out by the sound of the wind. The mission was simple: find Nadia, stop her before she could eliminate her next target. But nothing in this war was ever simple. Petrov's mind raced as they moved through the desert, the landscape shifting beneath the wheels of the vehicles. He kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for any signs of movement. Nadia had been gone for days, her whereabouts unknown, but he knew that she was out there, somewhere, waiting. Petrov's thoughts drifted back to the canyon, to the way Nadia had moved, to the precision of her shots. She hadn't hesitated, she hadn't shown any fear. She had been the calm in the storm, the one who knew exactly what she was doing. And now they were hunting her. The irony of it wasn't lost on him. The system that had abandoned her, that had turned her into a rogue agent, was now sending soldiers like him to find her and bring her down. They weren't chasing a criminal, they were chasing a ghost. The convoy moved through the desert for hours, the vast emptiness stretching on for miles. There was no sign of life, no sign of Nadia. But Petrov knew she was out there. And when they finally reached their destination, a small compound on the outskirts of the Western Territories, he could feel it. The air had changed, the tension was palpable. The mission was about to reach its climax. The team disembarked and moved silently toward the compound, their movements practiced, their senses heightened. Petrov led the way, his rifle held tightly in his hands. Every step felt heavier, as though the weight of the mission was pressing down on him. This wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about the truth. It was about what they were willing to do to stop Nadia. They reached the perimeter of the compound and began to set up their positions. Petrov's eyes darted to every corner, every shadow. Nadia could be anywhere. She could be watching them right now. He had no way of knowing. But one thing was certain: she wasn't going to go down without a fight. As the team moved in, Petrov heard the first shot. It was distant at first, a sharp crack that echoed through the night air, then another, and another. The compound erupted in chaos as gunfire rang out from every direction. Petrov's heart pounded in his chest as the team scattered, taking cover behind crates and vehicles. Nadia was here, and she was hunting them. Petrov moved quickly, his mind focused. He couldn't let her escape again. Not this time, not after everything. He moved through the compound, his rifle trained on every corner. And then he saw her. Nadya Halil, crouched behind a stack of crates, her rifle aimed at the approaching soldiers. She was calm, focused, her movements fluid and precise. She hadn't even noticed him yet. Petrov's hand tightened around his rifle, his breath coming in shallow gasps. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. But as he raised his weapon, something in his gut told him to stop. He froze, his eyes locked on hers. Nadia's gaze met his, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. There were no soldiers, no mission, just two people caught in the crosshairs of the war they both had become part of. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She just waited, her eyes never leaving his. In that moment, Petrov knew. This was the war. And there were no winners, only ghosts hunting each other across a battlefield that had no end. For what felt like an eternity, Staff Sergeant Dmitry Petrov and Nadya Halil stood locked in that moment, eyes meeting across the battlefield of dust and chaos. The gunfire raged around them, but in that instant there was only the quiet hum of the desert wind. Petrov's breath caught in his throat. He could hear the shouts of his men, the movement of his team around him, but none of it mattered. His weapon was raised, his finger on the trigger, but his body refused to move. Nadia's eyes never left his. There was no anger in them, no hatred, just the cold, calculating focus of someone who had seen too much, who had become something the world no longer recognized. She wasn't his enemy. She wasn't even a target. She was a ghost. And in that moment, Petrov understood. He had been chasing the wrong thing. She wasn't a threat to be neutralized. She was a reflection of the war they had all become a part of, a casualty of a system that devoured its own. Nadya Halil, Rachel Brennan, was the war itself, hidden in plain sight, and they had been sent to destroy what they had created. Petrov's hand trembled as he lowered his rifle, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a leaden weight. Behind him, his men continued to move, following orders without question, without hesitation. But Petrov had stopped. He had seen something they hadn't, something that could never be unmade. Nadia didn't move. She didn't lower her rifle. But for the first time, she wasn't hunting him. She wasn't hunting anyone. She was waiting for a choice to be made. Petrov swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to his team. He could hear Webb's voice in his ear, calm and commanding, urging him to move forward, to complete the mission. But the mission didn't matter anymore. Not this mission, not when it was built on lies and betrayal. "Sergeant," Webb's voice came again, but it was distant now, muffled by the weight of the decision Petrov had already made. Petrov slowly turned, his eyes lingering on Nadia for one last moment. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. She was a soldier who had been abandoned by her country, by the system, by the very people she had once served. And now, she was a ghost who wandered the war, picking off the pieces no one else cared to touch. Petrov exhaled sharply, then made his choice. He turned and walked toward his men. Webb was waiting for him, his eyes hard and unyielding. "What are you doing, Sergeant?" Petrov didn't answer immediately. He could feel the eyes of his men on him, their expectations, their questions. But he couldn't explain. Not now, not after everything that had happened. He had seen the truth. He had seen the real enemy. And it wasn't Nadya Halil. "She's gone," Petrov said quietly. "We don't have to hunt her." Webb's expression darkened, but he didn't argue. He had known from the start that Petrov wasn't like the other soldiers. Petrov wasn't just a weapon, he was a person. A human being caught in a war that didn't care about him or anyone else. Webb's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press further. Instead, he turned away, signaling the team to move forward. "We finished the mission," Webb said, his voice still cold. "We move out." Petrov followed his orders, but as they moved through the compound, his mind was elsewhere. He had made his choice. He had chosen to let her go, And in the back of his mind, he wondered if she would choose to do the same. Nadya Khalil had already vanished, slipping into the shadows, becoming just another ghost in a war that never seemed to end. But Petrov knew that for as long as the war raged, she would always be there, a silent witness, a soldier without a country, without a command. And perhaps that was the most dangerous thing of all. The next few days passed in a haze. The convoy moved out again, the mission continuing as if nothing had changed. But Petrov knew better. He knew that the war had claimed another soul, another soldier lost to the system, lost to the lies, and no one would ever know the truth. No one would ever understand why Nadya Khalil had done what she did. As they reached the outskirts of the compound, Petrov looked back at the canyon. He could still see her there, in his mind, standing on the ridge, watching them, waiting. And as the convoy rolled forward, he knew she would always be there, a ghost in the desert, waiting for the next target, the next war, the next mission, and no one would ever be able to stop her. Not unless they understood that she was the war itself, the part of it no one could see, no one could touch. And that was the truth no one wanted to admit. Weeks passed, and the operation continued, though for Petrov, the war had already shifted in ways he couldn't explain. The mission was straightforward on the surface, but his mind couldn't stop returning to the encounter in the compound, to the moment he'd lowered his rifle instead of pulling the trigger. The other soldiers carried on, focusing on the mission and the objectives ahead. But for Petrov, nothing felt the same. Nadya Khalil, Rachel Brennan, had made her choice, and Petrov had made his. There was no going back now. The convoy moved through the desert once again, this time with a different sense of purpose. The dust kicked up around them as they drove, the barren landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. But Petrov's mind was elsewhere, locked in a battle with himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set in motion the moment Nadia had disappeared from the compound. That moment, when they had both looked at each other, understanding that the war was bigger than either of them, bigger than the uniforms they wore. They were just pawns in a game that had no end. And Petrov knew that no matter what they did now, the war would continue. There was no victory, no peace, just a cycle of violence and survival. He thought back to the words General Webb had said in the briefing room. "We finished the mission." Petrov knew what that meant. They were all just following orders, moving through the motions like soldiers do. But deep down, Petrov understood that the mission would never be finished. Not as long as the war continued, not as long as they were part of it. The convoy reached its destination, a fortified compound at the edge of a village in the Western Territories. Petrov stepped out of the truck, his boots hitting the hard ground with a hollow sound. The air was thick with the smell of dust and diesel, the heat pressing down on him like a weight. The soldiers moved quickly, setting up their positions, preparing for the next phase of the mission. But Petrov couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to Nadia. He hadn't seen her since that day in the compound, and he knew he would never see her again. She had disappeared into the world, a ghost with no name, no allegiance. But somehow he knew she would keep hunting. Hunting the people who had turned the war into a business. The ones who profited from the bloodshed, and maybe, just maybe, she would make them pay. As the team secured the perimeter, Petrov stood at the edge of the compound, looking out over the vast expanse of desert. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the land. He could hear the chatter of soldiers behind him, but all he could think about was the choice he had made. Nadia was gone, and now it was time to move forward. But part of him knew that the war would always be with him, that he would always carry the weight of it, the weight of the choices they had all made. He turned away from the horizon and walked back to the compound, his mind heavy with the truth. The mission wasn't over. It would never be over. Not as long as the war continued. Not as long as they kept chasing the ghosts. "Sergeant," General Webb's voice interrupted his thoughts. Petrov looked up, meeting the general's eyes. Webb's face was as unreadable as always, but there was something different in his gaze now. "It's done," Webb said quietly. Petrov didn't ask what he meant. He knew. The mission was over, but for Petrov it had never really been about the mission. It had been about Nadia, about the ghosts they had all become. "We finished the mission," Webb had said, but Petrov had already finished his. He had already made his choice. And the war would continue, as it always did, long after they had all gone. As Petrov walked away from Webb, the weight of the past few days settled in his chest. He had let Nadia go. He had made peace with it. But the war had no peace to offer. It only offered more fighting, more bloodshed, more ghosts. "We finished the mission," Petrov muttered under his breath, but he knew deep down that the real mission had always been to survive. And he wasn't sure who, in the end, had won. Если эта история тронула вас эмоционально, подпишитесь на наш канал, напишите свое мнение в комментариях и поделитесь этим видео с другими.